And now, the Vietnam War. By the late 1960s, the Vietnam War was tearing America apart. On the front lines, soldiers fought a war with no end. At home, millions of Americans filled the streets in protest. They demanded answers. Why were their sons being drafted to fight in a war they couldn't win? How much longer would this conflict drag on? And what was the point of fighting in the first place? In 1968, the Tet Offensive shocked the world. North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces launched massive surprise attacks across South Vietnam. In the end, militarily speaking, the U.S. repelled them. But politically, it was a disaster. The American people realized that victory was far away. Year after year, the war dragged on. Finally, in 1973, the United States signed a peace agreement in Paris and began pulling troops out. But without American support, South Vietnam was left vulnerable. On April 1975, North Vietnamese tanks rolled through the streets of Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam. The final moments were chaotic. Helicopters evacuated Americans and their South Vietnamese allies from rooftops as the city fell. On April 30, 1975, the war ended. The cost was staggering. Over 58,000 American soldiers dead. More than 2 million Vietnamese civilians and fighters lost their lives, and a deep scar left on both nations. The Vietnam War was more than a battle. It was a lesson about power, politics, and the human cost of war. This is the story of the last days of the Vietnam War. It was a cold winter morning in 1975. A young medic named Mike was stationed in an American military base near Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam. He had been to Vietnam twice before, but this time was different. His mission? Evacuate as many people as possible. What was happening in Saigon? Why did the Americans need to leave? In the early 1950s, the country of Vietnam was in turmoil. After centuries of Chinese, French, and Japanese occupation, it won independence. Then it split into two, North Vietnam and South Vietnam. The North was communist, and the South was not. The United States supported the government in the South because it didn't want another communist country on its doorstep. Tensions escalated and soon the U.S. was at war. At first, the Americans had some success. But then something strange happened. The Vietnamese people didn't want their help. They suffered most from the war. As the years passed, Americans grew weary. How could they win a war if the locals hated their presence? It was a conflict without purpose. President Richard Nixon tried to end it with secret peace talks. In January 1973, a deal was struck. The U.S. would withdraw its troops and stop bombing North Vietnam. In return, the communists would release American prisoners of war. But there was one major problem. South Vietnam wasn't part of the deal. It was still officially at war with North Vietnam. Soon, the North Vietnamese army crossed over the border and headed for Saigon. If they took the city, all of South Vietnam would fall. That meant thousands of Vietnamese civilians and government officials who had worked with the Americans would be in grave danger. They needed help evacuating. That's where Mike came in. He and his comrades quickly loaded up helicopters with food, medicine, and supplies. They flew to the countryside and helped terrified families board the choppers. Then they headed back to the base. Before long, more refugees started showing up. Many had heard rumors that the Americans were leaving and wanted a ride to safety. Soon, every available helicopter was in use. Mike and his comrades worked around the clock. When they weren't flying missions, they prepared food and made sure everyone was ready to go. One evening, the base came under attack. Rockets and mortars rained down from the sky. Mike dove for cover along with everyone else. But he knew that evacuations wouldn't stop just because there was a battle. The wounded needed help. The dying needed comfort. When the attack ended, Mike got to work patching people up. It was the same story every day. Medics saved lives while others prepared for the next mission. Then one afternoon, word spread through the base. The evacuation was almost over. Just a few more flights and they'd be done. Suddenly, everything moved faster. Refugees lined up, ready to leave. Helicopters took off and landed every few minutes. Even the cooks and clerks pitched in. Everyone knew this was a race against time. But what did Mike and his comrades do when the last helicopter left? What would happen to them once the base fell? Like so many things during the Vietnam War, there was no clear answer. As the sun set over the Vietnamese jungle, thousands of refugees crowded the landing zone at the U.S. base. They sat on the ground, too afraid to move. Where would they go once the Americans left? What would happen to them? Suddenly, the sound of a helicopter broke the silence. The refugees looked up. Was this their salvation? Would they be rescued? Maybe. Every whir of the blades gave them hope. But there were too many people and not enough choppers. Inside the base, medics worked feverishly to patch up the wounded. For some, it was too late. The dying looked up at the helicopters with envy. They wished they could leave too. Days turned into nights, and the refugees slept in the open. Hunger and thirst became their constant companions. Still, they waited. Hope flickered like a candle in the wind. Meanwhile, inside the base, tension mounted. Everyone wondered how long the North Vietnamese army would wait before attacking. Some people prepared to fight. Others packed up what they could and waited. Time ticked by, each second filled with uncertainty. Then suddenly it happened. The tranquility of the night was shattered by gunfire and explosions. Rockets streaked through the darkness, followed by the thunderous roar of bombs. People screamed and ran for cover. The North Vietnamese army had arrived. What happened next was pure chaos. Explosions lit up the night sky. Gunfire echoed through the jungle. People ran in all directions, seeking refuge from the storm of destruction. Homes and buildings were engulfed in flames. Families huddled together, praying for the nightmare to end. Amidst the pandemonium, medics continued their work. They carried the wounded to safety, tending to their injuries as best they could. Their dedication, a beacon of hope in the darkness. Amidst the chaos, a group of South Vietnamese soldiers gathered. They were outnumbered and outgunned, but they refused to surrender. With guns in hand, they stood their ground, determined to defend their homeland. In the midst of the battle, a lone helicopter appeared. It was a lifeline of hope in the sea of chaos. The pilot offered rides to anyone who could make it to the landing zone. People stumbled onto the tarmac, desperation etched on their faces. The helicopter hovered, a beacon of possible escape in the turbulent night sky. As the hours passed, the fighting intensified. Homes were reduced to ashes, the stench of smoke filling the air. The fate of the city hung in the balance. Fear hung heavy in the air. Civilians and soldiers alike wondered what the coming hours would bring. The battle raged on, a symphony of destruction that echoed through the night. As dawn broke, a sense of foreboding settled over the city. The North Vietnamese army was advancing, their victory seemingly imminent. The Americans were gone, and the South Vietnamese were struggling to hold on. Suddenly, a rumor spread like wildfire through the city. Saigon had fallen. The North Vietnamese army had entered the capital. People looked at each other in disbelief. Could this be the end? As the news spread, panic surged through the city. People ran through the streets, each trying to escape the chaos. There was nowhere to go, no safe haven in sight. Cars honked, adding to the cacophony of fear and uncertainty. In the midst of the chaos, a group of South Vietnamese soldiers stood firm. They were trapped, surrounded by the enemy. Their options were grim: surrender or fight to the bitter end. Ours turned into days. The city was in ruins, a testament to the brutality of war. The fighting had stopped, but the fear remained. People emerged from their hiding places, their faces etched with exhaustion and despair. When the dust finally settled, the full extent of the destruction became clear. Homes were destroyed, streets were littered with debris. The city was a shadow of its former self. Among the ruins, people began the arduous task of rebuilding their lives. They cleared the rubble, hoping to find something salvageable amidst the wreckage. The spirit of resilience shone through their eyes. But amidst the rebuilding, there was a haunting realization. The war was far from over. The North Vietnamese army was advancing, their sights set on total victory. As the North Vietnamese army closed in, more refugees fled their homes, joining the throngs of people seeking safety in the face of advancing troops. Each step of the army brought new waves of fear and uncertainty. The final days of the war were marked by tragedy. Civilians paid the ultimate price as the conflict reached its climax. Homes burned, families were torn apart, and the future hung precariously in the balance. As the North Vietnamese army entered Saigon, a sense of finality settled over the city. The war was over. The cost of this long and divisive conflict was staggering. Thousands of lives had been lost, millions more forever altered. In the aftermath of the war, the world grappled with the consequences of this protracted struggle. The Vietnam War left an indelible mark on all who had lived through it. From the jungles to the cities, the scars of war ran deep. In the years since, efforts have been made to heal those wounds, to remember the fallen, and to seek a path toward reconciliation. The Vietnam War remains a powerful reminder of the human cost of conflict, a somber chapter in history that continues to shape the world today.